Welcome to Underdubs, a podcast about 70s progressive rock and more. This podcast is a conversational music variety show with a focus on the classic progressive rock artists of the 1970s and how their music has shaped culture, technology, and the music of today. We'll, of course, cover the classic prog bands like Yes and Genesis, but also other forms like the Canterbury scene, neo-prog, proto-prog, and fusion, and all points in between. Your hosts, Brian Donahue and Pat Strauser, are two of the founding members of the instrumental progressive rock fusion band Volare, based in Athens, Georgia, from the mid-1990s. In this episode, we ask the age-old question, what is progressive rock, and why do we like it so much? Finally, we introduce the Keyboard Corner, where we discuss the different keyboard instruments featured on most prog rock albums. This week, we talk about the Fender Rhodes electric piano. Be sure to check out the links that we provide in the notes for playlists and other content that we discuss here. We hope you enjoy the show. How's it going, Brian?
Hey, Pat. I'm wondering if you can help me define prog. What is prog?
I see that question asked a lot on these progressive rock Facebook groups that I'm a part of, and it's actually, I've noticed it's an annoying question for a lot of folks. Like, quit asking the question. But then again, some of the admins of these groups are quite strict in their definitions. So what's prog to one guy is not prog to someone else.
It gets, especially online, kind of contentious in the way that when people talk about the U.S. Constitution, are you a literalist?
Right.
Is it a living document?
Right, exactly.
Because I think there's a couple different ways to answer it. And for me, when I talk about prog or prog rock or progressive rock, I'm largely not just talking about a style of music, which we can get into. What is the style? How do you define the style? By and large, I'm also, and I think many people are also talking about an era. So to me, the exciting thing is it's prog rock or it's progressive rock. It's from 1969, 1970, 1971, up to the late 70s, maybe the early 80s. I mean, to me, that's the prog era.
Yeah, I agree.
And I kind of define that by what was going on in the music industry, the record industry, the radio industry. Mm-hmm. What could you get away with? What couldn't you get away with? And also the gear that was being used. What was cool then? What did things sound like? By the time of, say, 71, 72, when a lot of the famous prog bands made their major statements, it was like the perfect storm of cool sounds, cool technology, record labels letting them do what they wanted, and you get these 25-minute songs with, 19-minute synthesizer solos in them and whatever. So to me, it's not just the style of the music, but mostly when I'm talking about prog, I'm usually talking about an era, probably the 70s.
Yeah, I think that's a good place to start with it. I tend to look at it in two different ways. One is we'll call it the academic or textbook view. That's what I'll call it. And that's something like you've got distinct periods of music historically, like the Renaissance period and the Baroque period and the classical period. And those periods are all defined by 1600 to 1700 and things like that. And within those time frames, classical music is characterized by these compositional characteristics, these types of forms, rondo form, etc. And I think progressive rock, as we refer to it, is similar insofar as it is, we'll say, 1969 to 1979. I might be a little more generous and say 1965 to 1985 or something like that. Who knows?
Sure.
The music has these particular characteristics, these types of forms, these types of musical motifs or statements and instrumentation, all the rest of it. I think it bears mentioning too that there's another way of looking at the word. Sometimes you hear people say they won't even say progressive rock; they'll say progressive music. Is that music progressive? And then that becomes more like, oh, well, Nirvana was progressive for their time,
Right.
stuff like that.
I hear that a lot with like electronica, dance, EDM, and electronic artists. Like, oh, it's progressive.
Right.
Listen to it. No, like, oh, that's like techno industrial. Is that what you mean?
Right.
I'm like, yeah, progressive.
Yeah. The term progressive rock was coined in large measure because the music from 50 years ago that we're talking about was progressive. It was new, and it was boundary pushing and rule breaking and all the rest of it in the same way that progressive music, because that's sort of the term, that's what progressive means, I think. Although I do have an interest in seeking out and maybe not defining, but certainly understanding what might be happening even now that could be called progressive, and maybe how it kind of relates to kind of the classic prog.
Yeah,
that
and it doesn't, one doesn't cancel out the other.
Sure.
For my particular listening, I do kind of stop. Stop in the early 80s, typically, that's just me. But I get it, and music it's like the Constitution, where people are like, well, when I think of prog rock or progressive rock, I'm like, it's not a living document. It's died a death. And I like it the way it used to be. And others are like, no, it's still progressing. Like, well, maybe it is.
Right.
Maybe it is.
Right.
But I've tuned out.
1983 is the cutoff, right?
Basically.
I've very jokingly told people for years that I used to not listen to anything recorded after 1983. I've revised that position, but what got you into prog rock? Like, what was the thing? What was the catalyst? Like, what were you listening to before you got into prog, and what brought on the prog bug? Like, how did you get infected?
I could tell you what album got me infected, but I don't remember if I realized I was on like the cusp of something larger, or just I had this cassette tape and I thought, hey, that's pretty cool. I like it. I think for many people, maybe yourself included, there's that magic age of around like 7th or 8th grade here in the US, which is like 14, 15 years old, where many things in the world start to suddenly click. And music also kind of hit me all at once. And I had all kinds of influences coming at me from other directions. And I like plenty of other music, as not just 70s progressive rock. I believe it was maybe between 7th and 8th grade that summer. And I had a friend come over to spend the night, and he brought a cassette and accidentally left it behind. And I listened to it, I think, after he went home. And that cassette was Classic Yes, which is a compilation album. And I mean, what a way to get started. Did I realize that I was on the doorstep of this bigger universe? Probably not. Could I analyze why it was different than other stuff going around? Probably. There's also the classic rock influence. So if you're listening to And You and I by Yes, or whatever, Roundabout, in some ways it's not that much different than listening to classic rock radio, which is what every kid that I knew at that time would have been hearing in the car or whatever. It was, Boston and Allman Brothers or what have you, so it wasn't, and even some Jethro Tull, I think I was aware of the music of Jethro Tull before a lot of this other stuff. So I knew it was different, but I think it's repeated listens that brought me in.
I had almost the exact same experience.
Really?
Yeah. And I would say Classic Yes was the thing that kind of pulled me in too. Although I got started much later. I didn't get into that type of music until I was about 16. So I was a junior in high school. 1991, I would say, was a call-out year for popular music because of the grunge scene out of Seattle, Nirvana, Soundgarden, Pearl Jam, all that stuff that that got really huge, and I saw that happen. That was sort of in the background of my listening experience. I lived in Athens, Georgia, and I liked REM and the B-52s, kind of had to, in a way. But I also liked the pop music of the day. Tom Petty was popular, and Depeche Mode, and some other bands like that. U2. One thing about the bands that I liked at the time is that they were not hair metal. Like, I didn't like Motley Crue and Guns N' Roses and some of the...
Yeah, I actively disliked all that stuff as well.
And I think a lot of the reason was because there was something about them that seemed kind of sort of dirty. Like they were rabble rousers, and I don't know, that didn't appeal to me as a sensitive 15-year-old kid. For some reason, it just, I don't know. I would rather listen to Tears for Fears or something. I liked the pop music that was going on the radio and stuff, but also, to your point about classic rock, that was another huge part of the backdrop for me. It seemed like wherever you were going, if you went somewhere to a restaurant or someplace, classic rock was always playing. So it was always this sound bed of like Rod Stewart, like old Rod Stewart and Fleetwood Mac and Led Zeppelin and all that kind of stuff. And then, you would see it in the Columbia House flyers. So you remember those? Get 10 CDs for a penny. That mix of the popular stuff at the time and classic rock. I started listening to classic rock a lot on my stereo at home, and I would hear Emerson, Lake and Palmer and Yes and some of this stuff. The thing that got me hooked first was Rush, but I liked the stuff that I heard that I recognized was like the classic old, like Working Man and like the early, almost, they sounded more like Led Zeppelin. When I was 16, I got a hold of classic Yes, and I think that was the thing that really sealed the deal for me too, because it was Heart of the Sunrise in particular, because that was the opening track. It was just like, man, that was, because I think by that point I'd probably heard Black Sabbath, and I think I was well into my Led Zeppelin phase by that point. But that singular song was the bridge, and it was something because it was kind of heavy metal, kind of sophisticated. It's like, it was 10 minutes long, for crying out loud. It wasn't something you were going to hear on the radio or on MTV or something like that. It took me out of wherever I was. It wasn't business as usual. So I kind of didn't like the business as usual stuff. After I heard that, I was like, okay, it was time to move.
Ruined.
Yeah, I was ruined. I really was. It was time to move on to something else.
What's funny to me about that song, Heart of the Sunrise, which, obviously anybody listening to this podcast probably knows that's one of the biggest, landmark milestone Yes songs ever, right? I kind of played it to death in my teenage years. Played it to death. And so later on, maybe, I don't know, 10, 15 years ago, when I kind of started listening again to the records that I had grown up with after maybe not playing them so often, that song would come up on the Fragile album, and I'd think, I've played this one to death. I mean, what more do I need? And it was the parts that I used to feel like I had to sit through to get to the cool stuff that resonate with me now. So a lot of those Yes songs, there's a song by John Anderson, probably written on strumming his guitar in his bedroom. And then the band expands it and modifies it and modulates it and stretches it and squeezes it and all this kind of stuff. And it's the verses and the singing stuff that hit me now. I mean, the lyrics and everything. I mean, it's such a great tune. What got me in the first place, and maybe this is what you're describing too, as a 8th grader or whatever, wasn't the song part. It was the crazy music part, the part where they're, trying to sound like King Crimson.
Yeah. Yeah.
And succeeding and playing their butts off. And it sounds great. It's just such a great mixture of somebody writing a song with lyrics and taking it to a team of really, really good arrangers and good musicians with the sole intent of what can we do to this guy's song to make it unique and insane and memorable. And it works. I mean, when it works, it works. That's the thing about prog rock, progressive rock. It's so easy to make fun of, like, oh, the songs are 20 minutes long. I don't think I'm going to like it, or whatever. Or look how they're dressed, look at those bell bottoms and that cape. Right. And all that is true. It's all true. But when it works, it works. And the key criticism that I always feel like I have to defend the genre against is people that say, oh, it's cold and not emotional. And I just can't, it's all technical and I can't get it.
Yeah.
I'm like, no, it is not unemotional music at all. You listen to a Yes song from that period. It's ecstatically emotional. It's all right there in front of you.
Yeah.
You're maybe getting distracted, as I was as an 8th grader, by all the insanity that's going on and all the intricacies and all that, the window dressing, right?
Right. Yeah.
The arrangement. But inside of that, there's a guy singing a song and it works. And when it works, it works. Not everything worked in that era, but the things that worked, I still really love them. And I'm a grown up now, and people, I remember people telling me at the time, like, oh, you'll grow out of that stuff. Well, I didn't. I don't know if that's something wrong with me or something wrong with them, but I did not.
Just like I think any style, any band writing in any style can suffer from not being able to write a good song when you get right down to it. The prog rock guys were as guilty as anybody, but they, the ones that stand the test of time are the ones that know how to write a good song and then embellish it in a good way. And, I know that can be kind of subjective, but I do think that the other thing that progressive rock, if it's nothing if not ambitious, which I think is maybe the thing that people are most critical of. It's like, why does it have to be 25 minutes? Why are you writing a song about the meaning of all things? It's about God and, bicameral consciousness, all this kind of stuff. It's very lofty. And of course, with the robes, it's just, is it cult day today? Is that what's, it does there, because there's something that seems a little kind of floaty about it all. But, when it's done well and you got really good material and you got really good songs written and good arrangers, and then you have masterpieces. And Heart of the Sunrise is a great example of that. I think Yes had more than most of those bands. Just, I mean, it may sound a little highfalutin to call them masterpieces, but I mean, even the records that kind of get trashed, like Tales from Topographic Oceans from 1973 is a good example of one that I think when you dig down deep, even if you don't want to call those masterpieces, there's a lot of great material.
Oh yeah.
So many of these tunes, when you come back to them, there's so much that can reveal itself to you later than when you were younger.
I think of the main progressive rock bands, the big ones, sometimes they're called the Big Six, or depending on who you talk to, the Big Five, or whatever.
Right.
I think Emerson, Lake and Palmer is probably the easiest to square their music with the criticisms that are often thrown at progressive rock. And I get it. I really do. But I will say that the Trilogy album and the Brain Salad Surgery album, to me, they kind of serve as a pair. They're great. They're tremendous records. I don't love every song. I don't love every second of them. But I love those records. A lot of the stuff that happened in their career after that, I kind of agree with the critics, like, oh yeah, you're right.
Right.
But those two, I still think they were kind of dialed in. They're kind of in the zone of, it's a song, it's got lyrics about a thing,
right,
and we're embellishing it and we're making it bigger, perhaps too grandiose for some, But that brings us back to, why are they even doing that? Why are these musicians messing with these songs? What's wrong with the 3-minute song?
Right.
Nothing, right? The answer is nothing. But stylistically, what I've come to realize about my own listening habits over the half century that I've lived is repeated listening is important. And I need to hear something more than just 3 chords repeated 7 times with a bridge in the middle and a fade out. What we're talking about with these guys trying to create masterpieces, I guess, is, they were after something more. And when they got it, it really resonated with the public, but also with maybe folks like us who were not even born yet when this stuff was being created, and found it years later.
Right.
That's pretty amazing.
Yeah, it is. All of those guys, let's just say the big 5, all of those musicians were in their early to mid 20s when they were writing all of this stuff. All of it fairly groundbreaking for the time. It's weird how much, even now, as a close to 50-year-old man, I listen back to those parts and they're like canon. Even today, I would study that music in the same way some people would study Mozart, because it's got there's a similar quality to the music. And, and they make no bones about that, right? And it's interesting to me how much, it's like, no matter how much you try to recapture that moment, it's like, you can't change the fact that in 1970, the synthesizer was a brand new thing. You're never going to recapture that because the technology's moved on, the politics have moved on.
You only get one first time.
You only get one first time. Exactly. I mean, you've heard people talk about that with other, Hendrix and the Doors and all. It was a once in a lifetime thing. Not that there aren't exciting and innovative musicians that exist now or that have since, but it's, people ask me, not that a lot of people ask me, but whenever someone does ask me what I'm listening to now, it's like, it's stuff from the early 70s. It's just, I can't get enough of Close to the Edge. I can't get enough of those records. I just love them.
I think that's why we're doing this podcast, right?
Oh yeah.
So
this is our first keyboard corner. We thought we'd do a feature here on Underdubs where we talk about keyboard instruments that are used on progressive rock records, since keyboard instruments seem to feature so heavily in almost all, not all, but almost all progressive rock songs. We know about the Hammond organ and the Mini Moog and the Mellotron and many, many more. Those names of instruments are probably very familiar to progressive rock fans, but there are lots of other instruments that are out there, and we thought it would be kind of fun to feature them. I have a good number of them in my studio here.
For Keyboard Corner, we wanted to be able to show and demonstrate some keyboards that listeners have heard but maybe couldn't identify. Everybody reads the liner notes. Everybody sees the list of instruments.
Yeah.
Pat, you own a lot of these instruments, but in this way, we can maybe pick them out of your lineup and kind of focus on them so people can actually see what each one can do.
Right.
And today is the Fender Rhodes.
And today we thought we would start with an instrument that most people are probably familiar with by name, but as it turns out, according to some of my research at least, doesn't figure as heavily in the progressive rock style as one might think, and that would be the Fender Rhodes electric piano. The Fender Rhodes electric piano, for those that do not know, is not unlike a real piano in the sense that it has a hammer that strikes in this, not a string in the case of a piano, but in a tine mechanism that reverberates on what's called a tone bar, and that's what gives it its sound. Most people will recognize it in songs like Riders on the Storm by The Doors, played by Ray Manzarek. A lot of fusion artists, Jan Hammer from Mahavishnu Orchestra and the Jeff Beck Group, and many others. He used it a lot. George Duke used it a lot with Frank Zappa and a lot of his own solo material. Herbie Hancock used it. And of course, we can't forget Joe Zawinul of Weather Report, another big user of the Fender Rhodes. But when looking at progressive rock artists, you don't see it used quite so much. Brian, tell me, where have you seen the Fender Rhodes used according to your liner notes research?
Well, I could only think of 3 common, well-known examples. There've got to be more. Obviously, the Canterbury guys, Dave Stewart, especially used Fender Rhodes a lot. Mm-hmm. But in talking about the big 6 or the big 5 prog bands, not as much as you would think.
Yeah.
Was, Fender Rhodes is an electric piano, is an electro mechanical instrument, right?
That's true.
There's actually action going on that gets amplified.
That's right.
So it's not a synthesizer per se, right?
That's right.
Not everybody liked the sound for whatever reason. I think Tony Banks of Genesis preferred the RMI, which is baffling, but that was his choice. So the 3 examples I could think of in common prog, CP, common prog, are the incredibly annoying middle 8 section of Your Own Special Way by Genesis, and Rick Wakeman on the Yes cover version of the Simon and Garfunkel song America, which I love that song. It's my favorite cover song of all time. I love it.
Yeah.
Love it. I'm pretty sure he plays Rhodes on that.
Yeah.
And then, of course, Patrick Moraz on Yes's Relayer album. Definitely on Sound Chaser, but maybe on the whole thing. I'm not sure.
Yeah, you can definitely hear it on that intro section to Sound Chaser. There's a lot of delay on that intro part. I think I encountered a bit of a thread shootout with some people about that topic, maybe on Reddit, where someone was insisting that it was a Wurlitzer or an RMI or some other instrument, but it sounds, to my ears, very much like a Fender Rhodes. And, if we're honest, a lot of times it's hard to tell because some of these keyboard players, especially at that time in the history of the technology, they had a dozen keyboards on stage or in the studio at their dispense to record these tracks. So sometimes, who really knows? You have to go by hopefully accurate liner notes or just a good ear.
Well, as you pointed out to me, Pat, a lot of times when listeners like me hear an electric piano from the 70s, they think, oh, Fender Rhodes, but very often it's a Wurlitzer, which seems maybe more common. And to me, when I think of Wurlitzer, I think of Supertramp. It's that more, I don't know, muted tone, I guess you might say. But both of them were prevalent around the same time, so sometimes they get mixed up.
That's right. I think the Fender Rhodes, I like to say Fender Rhodes is to jazz what the Wurlitzer is to rock and roll. So you hear a Wurlitzer on Supertramp, and you'll hear it on a lot of rock records. Queen used it a lot, but also if the liner notes are anything to judge this topic by, then you see the Wurlitzer featured heavily in. I noticed it on the Gentle Giant liner notes for a lot of this stuff. For example, I was looking to see, is that a Fender Rhodes on Power and the Glory? And the only track that I believe it's on is Proclamation. The opening track has Fender Rhodes, I believe.
Is that the very beginning of the song you think is Rhodes?
I do believe it's, yeah, I sure do.
Okay.
If you do listen to the Rhodes, though, even depending on how you have the EQ set, it can even sound a little bit like a jazz guitar. Depending on how it's played. Not that sounds like a jazz guitar, but it does tend to sound... Here, I've put the treble at 12 o'clock, right in the middle. And so it's a lot even more mellower. Usually you'll hear it really bright. So I like to have it with the treble almost all the way out. And that's where you get the real chimey bell sound. And that's the sound I think that we're most familiar with. And of course, it's all over pop and rock records of the 70s and early 80s. It ended up falling out of favor to things like the DX7 and other digital synthesizers that came in and replaced these electromechanical devices. But bands like the Doobie Brothers and Ambrosia and really anybody used a Fender Rhodes if they needed a sound like the Bee Gees used it a lot. But speaking specifically of prog artists, it seems like it's kind of a short list. It just didn't seem to figure as heavily in their arsenal of sounds. So, one thing that you would hear with the Fender Rhodes is there's a real popular sound, which is the Script Phase 90 MXR, this is sort of like the Steely Dan sound where you get that. Or even Doobie Brothers and some of that kind of soft rock stuff has that sound.
Every yacht should have a Suitcase 73 on it.
It may have been written into law in the 70s that they all have it built in somewhere. But just some quick notes about the different models. I should say that the most popular models were the Fender Rhodes Stage and the Fender Rhodes Suitcase. The Fender Rhodes Stage is just a standalone piano on 4 metal legs with a foot pedal assembly that goes in the back. And then the Suitcase this model is a suitcase. And so it's the same piano that's resting on a cabinet with an amplifier section right here with volume, bass and treble faders, it's effectively a tremolo, but they call it a vibrato on the front panel. Well, the first one that I bought was a Stage 73, so it didn't have the cabinet. It was a Mark I. It was an older one. And I just loved the sound. When we got it for the band Volare, it instantly shaped the sound of the band, I'd say, and it became sort of the centerpiece of everything I did. So.
Well, it was like the backbone of our band for the entire time that we had the band. It would have been hard to do what we did without the Fender Rhodes on board.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, well, I think it kind of defines. I don't know. To me, it's like it's like the thing I said earlier. To me, if you hear a Fender Rhodes, it suggests jazz or it suggests fusion or something fusion-y. To me, it doesn't suggest progressive rock in the same way that a Hammond organ and a Mini Moog and a Mellotron or something like that suggests. Although those instruments feature in our material a good bit as well, especially on the uncertainty principle. But yeah, it's just a great sound. I didn't use, when I played it though, I wasn't using a Phase 90. I think I had an Ibanez chorus pedal, or I would either play through a chorus or I would play it dry like this.
Sounds good. It's also worth mentioning it's heavy, and we lugged it around in the back of what year was your car? 79 Volare?
That's right.
79 Plymouth Volare.
Mm-hmm.
A lot of sliding that big thing into the back seat of the Volare. And also there is maintenance involved because the metal tines which help generate the sound which gets amplified, they're prone to breakage. And I remember at the time, there was a number of keys that were just bad. Like, oh, don't play that one. Don't play high C, and don't, and it was a while before, I think you found a mail order catalog where some guy in the Midwest was manufacturing replacement parts, and you had to learn basically on the fly how to do maintenance to this device.
That's right. Yeah, I can't remember. I want to say it was called Smart Parts somewhere in Illinois. And the guy, I think the tines are $7 a piece, depending on the length. What would happen is you had, of course, the lower notes have longer tines, and the higher up you go, the shorter the tines get. And the tines work a little bit like a tuning fork. So on the tine, I don't have one to show you. It's hard to show you by opening up the case, but if you can imagine this tine, there's a little spring that runs along the length of the tine that you use to aid in tuning the note. So what would happen is you would get a set of tines, and you're like, oh, I got to replace an E flat, a low E flat, let's say, E flat 1, E flat 2. And you would have a sheet, like a little guide that told you the length of each note, and you would just line it up to the E flat 2 and get a pair of pliers or something, wire cutters, and cut it to length, and then move the spring just so to get the tuning right. And gosh, I haven't done that in quite some time, and I don't have any replacement tines for this one. So, but then again, I don't take this out at all.
Yeah.
This one stays right here. And it doesn't see the kind of action that old 73 stage had. Man, we moved that thing all over the place.
Yeah.
This is what it sounds like, and you'll recognize it when you hear it. Thanks for joining us again on this episode of Underdubs. Be sure to subscribe to us on YouTube and your favorite podcast platform, and follow us on Facebook and Instagram. See you next time.